These mind-expanding Zen tales unlock the pure bliss that exists within you right now. Before we journey together into these ancient teachings, I invite you to share where in the world you're listening from in the comments below. Whether you're in a quiet bedroom or a bustling city, you're part of a global community discovering the profound peace that comes from Zen wisdom. Tonight, let these tales dissolve the barriers between you and the boundless awareness that is your true nature. Each story carries the potential to shift your perspective, to reveal the ordinary magic hiding in plain sight, to guide you toward the bliss that needs nothing external to be complete. Let yourself receive these teachings without effort, allowing them to work on your consciousness as you drift into deep, restorative sleep. On a winter morning in Denver, Colorado, a man named Garrett sat in his downtown office, staring at spreadsheets that blurred together into meaningless numbers. He was a financial analyst at an investment firm, 34 years old, and completely numb to his work. For the past 8 years, he'd been climbing the corporate ladder, each promotion bringing more responsibility and money but less satisfaction. He'd bought the downtown condo, leased the luxury car, acquired all the markers of success his parents had encouraged him to pursue. Yet sitting at his desk, analyzing quarterly reports, Garrett felt nothing. Not unhappiness exactly, but a profound absence of meaning, like he was watching his life happen to someone else while he observed from a great distance. His colleagues seemed content with the routine, discussing bonuses and promotions with genuine excitement. Garrett would nod and smile, playing his part, but inside, he felt increasingly desperate. Was this really all there was? Wake up, work, exercise, eat well-prepared meals, watch prestige television, sleep, repeat. He'd tried various solutions over the years, traveled to exotic locations on vacation, dated interesting people, taken up expensive hobbies like rock climbing and craft beer brewing. Each new pursuit brought a brief spark of interest that quickly faded into the same grey numbness. He was beginning to suspect the problem wasn't external, that no change of circumstances would fill the emptiness he felt. One Friday evening after work, Garrett walked aimlessly through downtown rather than heading straight home. The February air was cold and sharp, the mountains visible in the distance under a clear sky. He ended up in a bookstore he'd passed hundreds of times but never entered. Drawn in by the warm light and the promise of distraction, he wandered through sections randomly, picking up books and putting them down without really seeing them. In the philosophy section, a slim volume fell from the shelf as he brushed past. He picked it up, intending to replace it, but the title caught his attention: Zen Mind. Beginner's mind. He'd heard of Zen Buddhism vaguely, associated it with meditation and minimalism, things that seemed appealing in theory but irrelevant to his actual life. He opened the book to a random page and read a passage that stopped him cold. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. The sentence seemed to speak directly to his condition. He'd become an expert at his life, following the script perfectly, checking all the boxes, and in that expertise, he'd lost all sense of possibility and wonder. He'd stopped being curious about anything, stopped being surprised, stopped genuinely experiencing his days because he already knew what they would contain. Garrett bought the book and took it home, staying up past midnight reading. The teachings were strange and paradoxical, full of riddles and contradictions that his analytical mind wanted to dismiss as nonsense. But something in them resonated deeper than logic. The book talked about the ordinary mind being the way, about finding enlightenment, not through special experiences or achievements, but through fully experiencing whatever was right in front of you. It described Zen masters who found profound peace in simple tasks like washing dishes or sweeping floors. Not because these tasks were inherently meaningful, but because they brought complete presence and attention to them. Garrett thought about his own life, how he never really tasted his food because he was reading the news on his phone, never really felt the water in the shower because he was mentally planning his day, never really saw the mountains on his commute because he was replaying work conversations. He was physically present for his life, but mentally and emotionally absent, always somewhere else. And the result was this pervasive sense of unreality and meaninglessness. The following week, Garrett did something impulsive and uncharacteristic. He took a day off work without any plan or destination, just a vague intention to try being present in the way the Zen book described. He drove up into the mountains, parked at a trailhead, and started hiking without his phone or any distractions. At first, his mind continued its usual patterns, reviewing work problems, planning future scenarios, judging his experience as it unfolded. But gradually, as he walked for hours through snow-covered forest, something began to shift. He noticed the particular quality of light filtering through pine trees. He felt the cold air entering his lungs. He heard the silence of the winter forest, not as absence of sound, but as its own presence. Vast and peaceful, he sat on a fallen log, overlooking a frozen lake. And for perhaps the first time in years, he wasn't trying to get anywhere or be anything other than what he was in that moment. There was nothing profound or dramatic about the experience. He was just a man sitting on a log, looking at a frozen lake. But in that simplicity, Garrett felt something he'd been seeking without knowing it. A quiet sense of completeness, of being enough exactly as he was, of life being enough exactly as it was. The feeling lasted only a few minutes before his mind kicked back into its usual patterns. But those minutes showed him something important. The bliss he'd been seeking through achievements and acquisitions and experiences was actually available in simple presence, in being fully here rather than constantly reaching for something else. When Garrett returned to work the following Monday, he tried to maintain the presence he'd touched on the mountain, but it proved nearly impossible. The office environment seemed designed to scatter attention in every direction. Emails demanding immediate response, colleagues interrupting with questions, meetings pulling him from task to task. By midweek, he'd lost whatever thread he'd found on that frozen lake. The numbness returned. Perhaps worse now, because he'd glimpsed an alternative. He found himself searching online for Zen centers in Denver, feeling slightly ridiculous but also desperate for guidance. He discovered a small center in the Capitol Hill neighborhood that offered introductory meditation sessions on Thursday evenings. The following Thursday, Garrett walked into a converted Victorian house that served as the Zen center. The space was simple, almost austere, with white walls and minimal furniture. About a dozen people sat on black cushions arranged in rows facing a wall. A teacher named Ruth, a woman in her 60s with close-cropped grey hair, greeted him warmly and showed him how to sit. She explained the basic form of Zazen, sitting meditation in the Zen tradition. Face the wall, sit upright, hands in cosmic mudra, eyes half closed, gazing downward. Breathe naturally, and when thoughts arise, don't follow them. Just return attention to posture and breath. The instructions were simple, but following them proved extraordinarily difficult. Garrett sat, facing the blank wall, his legs already aching from the unfamiliar position, his mind racing with thoughts about work, about how strange this all was, about whether he was doing it correctly. Ruth had said the session would last 40 minutes, which sounded manageable, but after what felt like an hour, Garrett checked the clock on the wall and discovered only 8 minutes had passed. The remaining time stretched ahead impossibly. His back hurt. His knees screamed. His mind would not stop its constant commentary and planning. He wanted desperately to stand up and leave, convinced he was wasting his time on something he clearly couldn't do. But embarrassment kept him in place. That, and a stubborn determination not to quit. Somehow he made it through the 40 minutes. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of sitting, Garrett felt simultaneously relieved and oddly disappointed in himself. During the tea and discussion afterward, he confessed to Ruth that he'd found the meditation nearly impossible, that he couldn't quiet his mind for even a few seconds. Ruth smiled with what looked like genuine delight rather than the pity he'd expected. She said something that confused him at first. "You think the goal is to quiet your mind. But that's not Zen practice. The goal is to sit. When you sit with a busy mind, you're doing it perfectly. When you sit with a quiet mind, you're also doing it perfectly. The practice is just sitting, not achieving some special state." Garrett didn't understand. What was the point of sitting and doing nothing? Of enduring discomfort without even trying to achieve a particular result? Ruth explained that most of our lives are spent in constant doing, always trying to get somewhere, become something, achieve some goal that will finally make us complete. Zazen is the practice of non-doing, of being completely present without agenda, without trying to improve or fix or change anything. This sounds pointless to our achievement-oriented minds, she said, but it's actually the most radical thing you can do. You're practicing being enough exactly as you are, not as preparation for some future moment when you'll finally be acceptable, but right now, just as you are, complete and whole. Over the following months, Garrett returned to the Zen Center every Thursday and eventually started attending morning meditation sessions as well. The practice never became comfortable in the way he'd imagined. His mind continued to race during sitting. His body continued to ache. But something was shifting in how he related to his experience. He stopped judging the busy mind as failure and the quiet moments as success. He began to see thoughts as just thoughts, arising and passing like weather, not requiring his attention or belief. Most significantly, he started to recognize moments throughout his day when he could bring the same quality of simple presence he was practicing in meditation. Eating lunch at his desk, instead of mindlessly consuming food while reading emails, he'd occasionally just eat, tasting each bite, feeling the textures, experiencing the simple act of nourishment. Walking from the parking garage to his office, instead of being lost in thought, he'd sometimes just walk, feeling his feet on the ground, noticing the morning air, seeing the mountains without thinking about them. These moments didn't transform his life or solve his problems, but they created small gaps in the constant mental noise, brief windows of direct experience that felt more real and alive than anything he'd known in years. He understood these were what the Zen teachings called glimpses of his true nature, the awareness that was present before all the thinking and striving and attempting to become something other than what he was. Ruth shared a teaching story with the group one evening about a wealthy man who traveled far to meet a famous Zen master. The man arrived at the master's humble dwelling and immediately began listing his accomplishments, his successful business ventures, his philanthropic work, his extensive study of Buddhist philosophy. The master listened politely while preparing tea. When the tea was ready, The master began pouring into the man's cup. He kept pouring even as the cup filled completely, tea spilling over the sides, onto the table and floor. The man watched in confusion until finally protesting that the cup was full. No more could go in. The master stopped pouring and looked at him. "Like this cup," he said. "You are full of your own accomplishments and knowledge. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" The man understood that his attachment to his achievements and identity was preventing him from actually experiencing the teaching. He needed to let go of everything he thought he knew, everything he thought he was, to make space for direct experience of reality beyond concepts. Ruth explained that this emptying wasn't about becoming nothing or denying your life and work. It was about recognizing that your true nature isn't any of the things you've accumulated or achieved, isn't your thoughts or feelings or roles or possessions. Underneath all that is simple awareness, simple presence, which needs nothing added to be complete. When you can rest in that, even briefly, you touch a bliss that doesn't depend on circumstances, a peace that's available regardless of whether your life is going well or poorly. Garrett found this teaching both liberating and terrifying. His entire identity was built on his achievements, his education, his career success, his possessions and status. Who would he be if he let all that go? Ruth addressed this fear directly. "You're not letting go of your actual life," she said. "You still go to work, pay your bills, maintain relationships, but you're letting go of the desperate clinging to these things as your identity, the belief that they define your worth. This allows you to engage with life more fully because you're not constantly worried about protecting and promoting a self-image. You can show up authentically, respond to what's actually needed, make choices based on genuine values rather than on maintaining an identity." 6 months into his Zen practice, Garrett experienced something that would deepen his understanding significantly. He was sitting in morning meditation at the center, the room quiet except for the sound of breathing and occasional shifts of posture. His mind was particularly busy that morning, churning through anxieties about a presentation he had to give later that day. He kept trying to return attention to his breath, but the thoughts grabbed him repeatedly, spinning elaborate scenarios of failure and embarrassment. Then, in a moment he couldn't have predicted or manufactured, something shifted. He suddenly saw the thoughts as just movements in awareness, like clouds passing through empty sky. The awareness itself remained unchanged, spacious and calm, regardless of what thoughts moved through it. This recognition lasted only a few seconds before his thinking mind reasserted itself, analyzing the experience, trying to figure out how to recreate it. But those few seconds showed Garrett something crucial. He wasn't his thoughts. He was the awareness in which thoughts appeared and disappeared. This distinction might sound abstract or philosophical, but experientially, it was profound. If he wasn't his thoughts, then the constant mental commentary about his inadequacy, his failures, his need to become something better, all of that was just weather patterns in the sky of awareness. Real in their own way, but not ultimately true about who he fundamentally was. His true nature was the sky itself, vast and unchanging, capable of holding any weather without being damaged or diminished by it. After meditation, Garrett tried to describe the experience to Ruth, stumbling over words, knowing he probably sounded ridiculous. She nodded with recognition and told him about a classic Zen exchange between a student and master. The student asked, "What is Buddha?" expecting some profound philosophical answer. The master replied, 3 pounds of flax. The student was baffled. What could this cryptic response possibly mean? Ruth explained that Zen teachings often point directly to reality beyond concepts. The master wasn't giving a metaphysical explanation of Buddha nature, but was pointing to direct, immediate experience. 3 pounds of flax was just what he was holding at that moment. The teaching was that Buddha nature, your true nature, is nothing other than this present moment exactly as it is. Not some special spiritual state you need to achieve, but the ordinary reality right in front of you when you stop looking elsewhere. Garrett understood this experientially now in a way he couldn't have from reading about it. The bliss the Zen teaching spoke of wasn't some extraordinary altered state requiring years of practice to attain. It was simply being fully present with ordinary reality, seeing it clearly without the filter of constant judgment and comparison, and reaching for something else. When he drank his morning coffee with complete attention, just tasting and feeling and experiencing without thinking about whether it was good enough or comparing it to better coffee he'd had, there was a simple satisfaction that needed nothing added. When he sat in traffic on his commute, if he could be present with just sitting rather than resisting the traffic and wishing he were somewhere else, the experience became neutral, even peaceful. The suffering came not from traffic itself, but from his mental story about how traffic was bad and shouldn't be happening. Ruth shared another teaching story. This one, about a student who spent years practicing meditation under a master's guidance, desperately seeking enlightenment. Every day he would sit for hours, concentrating intensely, trying to achieve some breakthrough. One day the master noticed him sitting with tremendous effort, face tense with concentration. The master picked up a tile and began rubbing it against a stone. The student watched for a while, then asked what the master was doing. "I'm polishing this tile to make a mirror," the master replied. The student said that was impossible. "You can't make a mirror by polishing a tile." The master smiled. "And you can't make a Buddha by sitting in meditation." The student was stunned. Wasn't meditation the path to enlightenment? The master explained that meditation practice isn't about manufacturing enlightenment through effort. You already are Buddha nature. You already have everything you're seeking. The practice is simply recognizing what's already true rather than creating something new. When you sit in meditation trying desperately to achieve enlightenment, you reinforce the very delusion that you're not already enlightened, that you need to become something other than what you are. True practice is relaxing into what's already present, recognizing the awareness that's here before you start trying to improve yourself. Ruth said this was why Zen practice emphasizes just sitting with no goal or agenda. You're not sitting to become enlightened. You're sitting because sitting itself is the expression of your already present Buddha nature. This teaching transformed Garrett's practice. He stopped approaching meditation as a technique to fix himself or achieve some special state. He simply sat. Whether his mind was busy or quiet, whether he felt peaceful or agitated, whether the sitting felt profound or completely ordinary, the practice became less effortful, less striving, more like resting in simple presence. This shift extended into his daily life as well. He stopped treating every moment as an opportunity to improve himself or get somewhere. He could just be at work, just be eating dinner, just be walking through his neighborhood, without the constant layer of commentary about whether the experience was good enough or how it could be better. Garrett's relationship with his job began to change as well. The work itself remained largely the same, analyzing financial data, preparing reports, attending meetings, but he stopped using his performance as a measure of his fundamental worth. When he did good work, he could appreciate it without needing it to validate him. When he made mistakes, he could acknowledge them without spiraling into self-judgment and inadequacy. The job was just something he did, not who he was. This lighter relationship made the work more bearable, even occasionally enjoyable, because he wasn't carrying the weight of his entire identity into every task. One afternoon, Garrett was walking back from lunch when he passed a homeless man sitting on the sidewalk asking for money. Normally, Garrett would avert his eyes, caught in the familiar discomfort and guilt, hurrying past to avoid the encounter. But this time, he stopped. He didn't have some noble intention to help. He simply found himself present with this person, rather than lost in thoughts about the situation. He made eye contact and really saw the man, not as a problem or a moral test, but as another human being sitting on a cold sidewalk. They exchanged a few words. Garrett gave him some money, but what struck him afterward wasn't the transaction, but the moment of genuine human connection, of seeing and being seen without all the usual layers of judgment and self-consciousness. This kind of moment started happening more frequently. Small encounters throughout his day that he would normally rush through or miss entirely became opportunities for simple presence and connection. The barista making his coffee, the security guard in his building, the colleague who stopped by his desk with a question. All of them became less like obstacles or means to an end, and more like actual people worthy of attention and respect. Garrett wasn't becoming a saint or radically transforming into someone new. He was simply present more often, less lost in thought, more available to direct experience. And in that availability, life became richer, more textured, more real. Current word count, approximately 950 words. Ruth began teaching the group about koans, the paradoxical questions and statements that Zen masters use to break through conceptual thinking. She shared one of the most famous koans, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Students hearing this for the first time usually try to figure it out logically, searching for a clever answer. But Ruth explained that koans aren't intellectual puzzles to be solved. They're designed to exhaust the thinking mind, to push you beyond concepts and logic into direct experience of reality. When your rational mind gives up trying to answer, sometimes something else emerges, a different way of knowing that isn't based on thought. She gave the group a koan to work with. Show me your original face, the face you had before your parents were born. Garrett found this completely baffling. How could he have a face before his parents existed? The question seemed like nonsense. But Ruth instructed them to sit with the koan, not trying to figure it out intellectually, but holding the question in awareness and seeing what arose. Garrett spent weeks sitting with this koan, initially frustrated by its apparent impossibility, then gradually relaxing into not knowing. He noticed that when he stopped trying to answer the question and simply held it lightly in awareness, something shifted. The question pointed beyond his acquired identity, beyond everything he'd learned and become, to something more fundamental. One morning during sitting meditation, the koan suddenly became transparent in a way Garrett couldn't have anticipated. His original face wasn't something he had before birth. It was the awareness itself, the consciousness that had always been present throughout his entire life, unchanged by all the experiences and identities that had come and gone. Every thought, every emotion, every experience had appeared in this awareness and dissolved, but the awareness remained constant, like a mirror that reflects everything without being changed by any reflection. This recognition wasn't an intellectual understanding, but a direct seeing. Obvious, once glimpsed, though easily forgotten when thinking reasserted itself. Ruth nodded when Garrett tried to describe this to her, then warned him gently against getting attached to the experience. Zen practice, she said, is full of these moments of seeing, but they're not achievements to collect. or proof of progress. They're just moments when the clouds part temporarily and you see what's always been true. The practice is continuing to sit, whether you're having profound insights or dealing with mundane restlessness. Whether you feel enlightened or completely ordinary. In fact, attachment to special experiences is one of the main traps on the Zen path. You start seeking peak moments rather than being present with ordinary reality, which is where true freedom actually lives. Garrett had been practicing for nearly a year when he made a significant decision. He quit his job at the investment firm and took a position at a non-profit organization working on affordable housing policy. The pay was substantially less, and his parents were baffled by what they saw as career suicide. But Garrett had realized through his Zen practice that he'd been living someone else's idea of success, following a script written by societal expectations rather than his own genuine values. The work at the non-profit was harder in some ways, the problems more complex and less solvable, but it felt aligned with what actually mattered to him. He was using his analytical skills in service to something he genuinely cared about, rather than just accumulating wealth for people who already had more than enough. His lifestyle simplified as well. He moved from his downtown condo to a smaller apartment in a less trendy neighborhood, sold his luxury car, and started biking to work. Let go of the expensive hobbies and restaurant habits that had been more about status than genuine enjoyment. These changes weren't about deprivation or becoming some kind of ascetic. They were about removing the unnecessary complications that had cluttered his life, creating more space for what actually brought him alive. He found he enjoyed the simplicity, the reduced financial pressure, the extra time that came from not constantly maintaining an image. Ruth shared a teaching about the Zen concept of chopping wood, carrying water. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The teaching points to the understanding that awakening doesn't transport you to some special realm where ordinary tasks disappear. You still have to live your actual life, do your work, handle your responsibilities. The difference is in how you meet these ordinary tasks. Before awakening, you're lost in resistance and desire, always wanting to be somewhere else, doing something else. After awakening, you can be fully present with whatever task is at hand, finding completeness in the ordinary rather than constantly reaching for the extraordinary. Garrett recognized this pattern in his own experience. His life from the outside looked simpler, perhaps less impressive than before. He had less money, lower status, a smaller living space. But internally, he felt richer, more alive, more genuinely himself. He wasn't using his life as raw material to construct an impressive identity. He was simply living, showing up for work that mattered, practicing Zen, developing real friendships with people at the center, being present with his actual experience rather than constantly performing for an imaginary audience. The bliss the Zen teaching spoke of wasn't some extraordinary state, but this simple presence with ordinary reality, this release from the constant burden of trying to be someone impressive. One evening after meditation, a newer student asked Ruth how long it takes to become enlightened through Zen practice. Ruth laughed and said that the question itself reveals a misunderstanding. Enlightenment isn't something you achieve in the future through accumulating practice hours. It's recognizing what's already true right now. You could practice for 50 years and miss it entirely if you're always looking ahead to some future attainment. Or you could recognize it in an instant if you stop long enough to see what's already present. The practice isn't about getting somewhere. It's about being here, fully and completely, which is the only place enlightenment has ever been available. Ruth shared a teaching about the Zen concept of chopping wood, carrying water. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The teaching points to the understanding that awakening doesn't transport you to some special realm where ordinary tasks disappear. You still have to live your actual life. Do your work. Handle your responsibilities. The difference is in how you meet these ordinary tasks. Before awakening, you're lost in resistance and desire, always wanting to be somewhere else, doing something else. After awakening, you can be fully present with whatever task is at hand, finding completeness in the ordinary rather than constantly reaching for the extraordinary. Garrett recognized this pattern in his own experience. His life from the outside looked simpler, perhaps less impressive than before. He had less money, lower status, a smaller living space, but internally, he felt richer, more alive, more genuinely himself. He wasn't using his life as raw material to construct an impressive identity. He was simply living, showing up for work that mattered, practicing Zen, developing real friendships with people at the center, being present with his actual experience rather than constantly performing for an imaginary audience. The bliss the Zen teaching spoke of wasn't some extraordinary state, but this simple presence with ordinary reality, this release from the constant burden of trying to be someone impressive. One evening after meditation, a newer student asked Ruth how long it takes to become enlightened through Zen practice. Ruth laughed and said that the question itself reveals a misunderstanding. Enlightenment isn't something you achieve in the future through accumulating practice hours. It's recognizing what's already true right now. You could practice for 50 years and miss it entirely if you're always looking ahead to some future attainment. Or you could recognize it in an instant if you stop long enough to see what's already present. The practice isn't about getting somewhere. It's about being here, fully and completely, which is the only place enlightenment has ever been available. She told a story about a monk who practiced diligently for decades, following every rule, meditating for hours daily, studying texts thoroughly. One day, he was sweeping the monastery courtyard when a pebble he'd swept up hit a bamboo stalk with a sharp crack. In that instant, hearing that sound completely, without any thought about it, he experienced sudden awakening. He laughed at himself for all the years of searching when the truth had been right here in every ordinary sound, every mundane task, every simple moment he'd overlooked while seeking something extraordinary. The pebble hitting bamboo wasn't special. What was special was that in that moment, he was completely present, completely here, without the filter of seeking or striving that had separated him from direct experience. Garrett had his own version of this recognition, though less dramatic than pebbles and bamboo. He was washing dishes one evening in his small apartment kitchen, hands in warm, soapy water, scrubbing a plate clean. Normally this would be a task to rush through, his mind already moving ahead to what came next. But he found himself simply washing dishes, feeling the warm water, seeing the bubbles, hearing the sounds, with no thought about it being mundane or boring or something to get through. In that simple presence, he felt a completeness that needed nothing added, a quiet bliss that came from being fully here rather than mentally somewhere else. The moment passed quickly, thought reasserting itself, but it showed him again that what he'd been seeking through achievements and possessions and special experiences was actually available in the most ordinary activities when he brought full presence to them. 2 years into his Zen practice, Garrett attended a week-long silent meditation retreat at a monastery in the mountains outside Boulder. The retreat was intensive. Sitting meditation from 4 in the morning until 9 at night, with short breaks for meals and walking meditation. No talking, no reading, no distractions. Just sitting facing a wall for hours on end. Garrett had been nervous about whether he could handle the intensity, but he found that the extended silence created a different quality of awareness than his usual practice. Without the constant input of conversation and entertainment, his mind gradually settled, like sediment in water sinking to the bottom, leaving the water clear. On the 4th day of the retreat, during afternoon sitting, Garrett experienced what Zen calls kensho, seeing one's true nature. He couldn't have said what triggered it. He was simply sitting, aware of his breath, when suddenly the sense of separation between himself and everything else dissolved completely. There was no Garrett observing his breath, just breathing happening. Awareness, aware of itself, with no one separate doing the observing. This wasn't a thought or understanding, but a direct recognition, completely obvious, like suddenly seeing something that had been right in front of him all along. The experience lasted perhaps 30 seconds before the thinking mind reasserted itself, trying to grasp and understand what had just happened, which immediately ended the recognition. Later, during a private interview with the retreat teacher, Garrett tried to describe what had occurred. The teacher, a monk named Thomas, who'd practiced for 40 years, smiled and said that kensho experiences are common on intensive retreats. They can be valuable in showing you what's possible, what's actually true beneath the usual sense of separate self. But he warned against 2 common mistakes. First, getting attached to the experience and spending the rest of your practice trying to recreate it. Second, thinking that the experience is enlightenment itself, some permanent state you've achieved. True Zen practice, Thomas said, is continuing to sit and be present, whether you're having profound experiences or dealing with knee pain and boredom, recognizing that your Buddha nature is equally present in both. Thomas shared a teaching about Dogen, the founder of Soto Zen, who emphasized that practice and enlightenment aren't separate. You don't practice in order to achieve enlightenment at some future time. The practice itself is enlightenment, the expression of your already present Buddha nature. When you sit in meditation with no goal, no agenda, no trying to get anywhere, that goalless sitting is itself enlightenment. When you wash dishes with complete presence, that's enlightenment. When you walk down the street fully aware of walking, that's enlightenment. It's not some special altered state, but simple, ordinary presence with whatever is arising in this moment. Current word count, approximately 5. 900 words. Garrett returned from the retreat changed in subtle ways he couldn't quite articulate. The kensho experience itself faded into memory, but something about how he inhabited his life had shifted. He was less caught up in the content of his thoughts, better able to see them as passing mental events rather than absolute truth. The background anxiety that had accompanied him for years, the sense that something was wrong and needed fixing, had quieted significantly. He still had concerns and challenges, still felt stress and uncertainty, but these arose within a larger spaciousness that wasn't disturbed by them. He'd touched what the Zen teachings called his original nature, the awareness that was present before all the conditioning and beliefs, and that recognition had changed his relationship to everything. Several months later, Garrett's father suffered a serious heart attack. Garrett flew home to Ohio to be with his family during the crisis and recovery. The old Garrett would have been overwhelmed by the situation, paralyzed by fear and helplessness, unable to be present with the difficulty. But his Zen practice had given him capacity to be with suffering without being destroyed by it. He could sit with his mother in the hospital waiting room, present with her fear without needing to fix it or make it go away. He could help his father through the difficult recovery, dealing with practical needs and emotional upheaval, while maintaining his own center. When grief arose, he felt it fully. When fear came, he acknowledged it. But he wasn't swept away by these emotions, didn't lose himself in catastrophic thinking. His parents noticed the change in him. His mother remarked that he seemed calmer, more solid somehow. His father, recovering slowly, asked about his life in Denver, whether he was happy with his choices to leave the corporate job and simplify his life. Garrett told him honestly that he was happier than he'd ever been, not because his external circumstances were perfect, but because he'd learned to be present with his actual life rather than constantly wishing it were different. His father listened quietly, then said something that surprised Garrett. He said he'd spent his whole life chasing success and security, building a comfortable life, but he'd rarely stopped to actually enjoy it. Always worried about what might go wrong or what more he needed to achieve. This heart attack had forced him to confront his mortality, to recognize how much time he'd wasted not being present with the people and moments that actually mattered. They had several deep conversations during Garrett's visit, speaking more openly than they ever had before. Garrett shared some of the Zen teachings that had helped him, not trying to convert his father, but simply offering what he'd learned. His father was surprisingly receptive, asking questions, genuinely curious about this practice that had so clearly affected his son. Before Garrett returned to Denver, his father asked if he could recommend some books about Zen. Garrett gave him the same Zen mind, beginner's mind, that had started his own journey. He had no expectations about whether his father would actually read it or practice, but he felt grateful for the opening, for the possibility of connection beyond their usual roles and patterns. Back in Denver, Garrett continued his practice and his work at the nonprofit. He'd been promoted to Director of Research, overseeing analysis of housing policy and affordability issues across the region. The work was challenging and often frustrating, trying to address massive systemic problems with limited resources. But Garrett approached it with a long view, understanding that meaningful change happens gradually, that his job was to show up and do good work without attachment to seeing dramatic results. Some days the work felt meaningful and impactful. Other days it felt futile. But he'd learned that his sense of purpose didn't need to depend on constant visible progress. He could find satisfaction in the work itself, in bringing careful attention and genuine effort to complex problems, regardless of whether solutions emerged on any particular timeline. Ruth began teaching about the Zen principle of non-attachment, which students often misunderstood as not caring about anything. She explained that non-attachment doesn't mean emotional coldness or indifference. It means engaging fully with life and relationships while not clinging desperately to outcomes or demanding that things be other than they are. You can love deeply without attachment, care passionately without grasping, work diligently without needing specific results to validate you. Non-attachment is about freedom, the freedom to be fully present with whatever arises without being destroyed when it changes or disappears, which everything eventually does. This freedom, she said, is the foundation of genuine bliss, a peace that doesn't depend on controlling circumstances, but comes from accepting them exactly as they are. She told a story about a Zen master who lived through the devastation of war. watching his monastery burn, his students scattered or killed, his entire life's work destroyed. When someone asked how he could remain at peace amid such catastrophe, he said that peace doesn't come from things going well. It comes from accepting what is, even when what is includes terrible loss and suffering. This doesn't mean liking what's happening or being passive about injustice. It means acknowledging reality as it actually is rather than exhausting yourself fighting against what's already occurred. From that acceptance, you can respond wisely to what needs to be done, rather than being paralyzed by resistance and denial. Garrett had a chance to practice this teaching when his relationship with his girlfriend ended after nearly a year together. She'd been drawn to the changes she saw in him after he started practicing Zen. But over time, she felt he'd become too detached, too accepting, not passionate enough about building a future together. The breakup hurt, triggered all his old fears of being fundamentally unlovable. But he could feel the pain without making it mean something terrible about himself, could grieve the relationship while recognizing that its ending didn't diminish what had been genuine and valuable about the time they'd shared. He sat with the loneliness and sadness, let them move through him, and found that on the other side was spaciousness and even a kind of peace. He was learning to hold loss lightly, to let life flow through him, rather than desperately grasping at what he wanted to keep. Current word count, approximately 900 words. Through his practice, Garrett was discovering what the Zen masters meant by the phrase nothing special, enlightenment, awakening, Buddha nature. All of these pointed to something utterly ordinary that became extraordinary only when you stopped overlooking it in favor of seeking something more impressive. Walking to work on a spring morning, feeling the sun on his face, seeing the mountains against the blue sky, hearing birds in the trees. This simple sensory experience was complete in itself, needed nothing added, was the bliss he'd been seeking all along. But his mind had been so busy reaching for future goals and reviewing past failures that he'd missed the aliveness right in front of him. Now, more often though not constantly, he could be present with the ordinary magic of simple existence. Ruth invited the Sangha, the meditation community, to a day of mindful work at the center. They would spend the day cleaning, gardening, doing repairs, all in silence, with the same meditative attention they brought to sitting. Garrett found himself assigned to washing windows, a task that seemed mundane and boring. But as he worked, bringing complete attention to the simple movements, spray bottle, wipe, squeegee, he discovered a kind of satisfaction in the work itself. The windows became progressively cleaner, and there was something deeply pleasing about seeing clearly through glass that had been obscured. He understood this was a metaphor for the practice itself, clearing away the layers of thought and concept that obscured direct seeing, allowing reality to be perceived without distortion. During lunch break, eaten in continued silence, Garrett sat on the center's back porch, overlooking a small garden. A sparrow landed nearby, pecked at the ground, flew away. The simple event was complete in itself, perfect without needing meaning or interpretation. Garrett felt tears in his eyes, though he couldn't have said why. Something about the sparrow's perfect ordinariness, its complete unself-consciousness, touched him deeply. This was what the Zen teachings meant by suchness, the quality of things being exactly what they are without elaboration or judgment. The sparrow was just completely, perfectly sparrow, and Garrett, in that moment of seeing, was just completely, perfectly aware. Nothing special, nothing lacking. 3 years into his practice, Garrett was asked by Ruth to help lead introductory sessions for new students. He was hesitant, feeling like he was barely a beginner himself. But Ruth insisted that teaching is one of the best ways to deepen your own understanding. Garrett found himself sitting with newcomers who reminded him of his own early confusion and struggle. People seeking something they couldn't name, hoping meditation would solve their problems or make them feel better. He shared honestly about his own journey, how Zen practice hadn't solved his problems or made him into some blissed-out, enlightened being. Instead, it had changed his relationship to his problems, his life, his own mind. It had shown him that the peace he was seeking had always been available, hidden only by his constant reaching for something else. One evening, a new student asked the question Garrett himself had once struggled with. "What's the point of just sitting and doing nothing?" Garrett smiled, recognizing his younger self in the question. He said that from the perspective of our achievement-oriented culture, sitting, meditation does seem pointless. You're not producing anything, not getting anywhere, not improving yourself in measurable ways. But that's exactly why it's so valuable. Your entire life is spent doing things to achieve goals, to become someone better, to prove your worth. Zazen is the practice of being enough exactly as you are, not as preparation for some future moment when you'll finally be acceptable. But right now, that practice of non-doing, of goalless presence, gradually reveals the bliss that's been here all along, obscured by your constant striving. Garrett had learned what the ancient Zen masters discovered centuries ago, that awakening isn't about achieving some special state or becoming an extraordinary person. It's about recognizing the extraordinariness of ordinary existence, the miracle of simple awareness, the completeness that's present before you start trying to improve anything. The journey from Denver office numbness to genuine presence hadn't required dramatic life changes or heroic effort. It had required learning to stop, to be here, to see what was already present beneath all the mental noise. And in that stopping, in that simple presence, he'd found the pure bliss the Zen teachings promised. Not as a peak experience to chase, but as the natural state revealed when you stop chasing. In Portland, Oregon, a woman named Isla worked as an emergency room doctor at a major hospital. She was 42 years old and had practiced medicine for nearly 15 years, saving lives, treating trauma, making split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. The work had taken a profound toll on her, though she'd only recently begun to acknowledge it. She'd developed a hard shell of professional detachment, necessary to function in an environment of constant crisis, but which had started bleeding into her personal life. Her partner Drew complained that she was emotionally unavailable, unable to be present when not at work, always carrying the tension and hypervigilance of the emergency room, even during their supposedly relaxing time together. Isla knew Drew was right, but didn't know how to change. The emergency room demanded complete focus and intensity. No room for softness or vulnerability when someone was bleeding out on the table. She'd learned to operate from a place of controlled adrenaline, making rapid clinical assessments, giving orders, cutting through chaos with decisiveness and authority. It worked brilliantly at the hospital, but at home, Drew didn't need a crisis manager. He needed a partner who could relax, laugh, to be tender, allow herself to be vulnerable. Isla couldn't access those qualities anymore. She'd armored herself so thoroughly against the trauma of her work that she couldn't remove the armor even when it was safe to do so. One particularly brutal shift, Isla lost 3 patients in the span of 6 hours. a motorcycle accident victim who'd arrived with catastrophic injuries, an elderly woman who coded during treatment for a heart attack, a young man who'd overdosed and couldn't be revived despite aggressive intervention. Isla handled each death with clinical professionalism, documented everything properly, moved on to the next patient. But driving home after her shift ended, she found herself unable to stop shaking. She pulled over in a parking lot and sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe normally. The armor had cracked, and everything she'd been holding back was flooding through. Drew found her an hour later, still sitting in the car, after she didn't respond to texts. He drove her home, helped her into bed, held her while she cried for the first time in months. The next day, Isla called in sick for her scheduled shift, something she'd done perhaps twice in her entire career. She knew she couldn't keep going like this, functioning at work while slowly disintegrating internally. Drew suggested she talk to someone, see a therapist, but Isla resisted. She'd always handled her problems herself, prided herself on her strength and resilience. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that she couldn't cope, but Drew persisted gently. And eventually, Isla agreed to attend a workshop for healthcare workers dealing with burnout and compassion fatigue. The workshop was held at a retreat center in the Blue Mountains, led by a psychologist named Dr. Chen, who specialized in working with medical professionals. Dr. Chen began by acknowledging what everyone in the room already knew, that healthcare work involves constant exposure to suffering and death, that the emotional toll is enormous, that the usual advice to just practice better self-care misses the deeper issue. The question, she said, isn't how to avoid being affected by your work. The question is how to remain open-hearted in the face of suffering without being destroyed by it. Dr. Chen introduced the group to meditation practices from Zen Buddhism, explaining that these weren't religious techniques but practical methods for working with the mind and emotions. She taught them a practice called Tonglen, breathing in suffering and breathing out relief. The practice seemed counterintuitive at first. Why would you deliberately take in pain? But Dr. Chen explained that the practice wasn't about actually absorbing others' suffering. It was about developing the capacity to face difficulty without shutting down, to remain present with pain rather than armoring against it. When you practice breathing in suffering, you're training yourself to stop running from what's hard, to develop the strength to meet it directly. They practiced together, sitting in silence, breathing in the suffering they encountered in their work, breathing out compassion and relief. Isla found herself crying during the practice, not from overwhelming sadness but from a sense of release, like pressure that had been building for years was finally being allowed to vent. After the practice, Dr. Chen asked participants to share their experiences. Isla spoke about how she'd been trying so hard to protect herself from her patient's pain that she'd become numb to everything, including joy and connection. She'd thought detachment was the only way to survive her work, but she was realizing that it was actually destroying her capacity to be fully human. Dr. Chen nodded with understanding and shared a Zen teaching about the difference between detachment and equanimity. Detachment, she explained, is shutting down, closing your heart to protect yourself from feeling. Equanimity is remaining open and present with whatever arises while maintaining your inner balance. Detachment makes you hard and brittle. Equanimity makes you strong and flexible. The practice is learning to feel everything fully. The pain, the grief, the helplessness, without being overwhelmed by it. holding it all within a larger awareness that isn't destroyed by any particular content. This is what Zen calls the immovable mind. Not rigid or frozen, but stable and centered regardless of external chaos. She told a teaching story about a Zen monk who worked as a hospice caregiver, sitting with dying patients, witnessing their fear and pain and grief. Someone asked how he could do this work without becoming depressed or burned out. The monk said that he cried with every patient, felt genuine sorrow at every death, but the tears flowed through him like rain through open sky. He didn't hold on to the grief or make it about himself. He allowed himself to be fully present with each person's suffering, to offer genuine compassion, and then to release it when the moment passed. This wasn't coldness or indifference. It was the capacity to be completely with someone in their pain without adding his own suffering through resistance or attachment. Isla understood this as the quality she'd been missing. She'd been either completely armored or completely overwhelmed, oscillating between numbing detachment and emotional flooding. What the Zen teaching pointed to was a middle way, remaining open and compassionate while maintaining stability, feeling everything while being destroyed by nothing. Over the weekend workshop, she practiced this different way of being, sitting in meditation, doing walking meditation in the mountain forest, sharing meals in mindful silence. The practices created a quality of presence she hadn't accessed in years, a way of being alert and aware without the constant tension and hypervigilance. Dr. Chen taught them about shikantaza, just sitting meditation from Soto Zen. Unlike concentration practices that focus on a specific object like the breath, shikantaza is objectless meditation, open awareness that includes everything arising in the field of consciousness without attaching to or rejecting anything. Thoughts, sensations, sounds, all arising and passing in spacious awareness. Dr. Chen explained that this practice was particularly valuable for people in helping professions because it trained you to hold multiple things in awareness simultaneously without becoming overwhelmed, to remain centered while chaos swirled around you. This was exactly the capacity Isla needed for emergency room work, the ability to be aware of everything happening while maintaining her own center. When Isla returned to work the following week, she brought the shikantaza practice with her. During her shifts, in the brief moments between patients or procedures, she'd take a few conscious breaths, opening her awareness to include everything present without narrowing into tunnel vision. She found that this practice actually enhanced her clinical effectiveness rather than distracting from it. She could be aware of the patient in front of her, the monitors and equipment, her team members, the sounds and activity throughout the emergency department, all held in spacious awareness rather than the stressed, constricted attention she'd been operating from. The hypervigilance eased slightly, replaced by a more relaxed but equally alert presence. Isla also started sitting in meditation every morning before work. Just 20 minutes of shikantaza, allowing whatever arose in consciousness to be present without interference. Some mornings her mind was quiet. Other mornings it churned with anxiety about the day ahead. But she was learning not to judge the quality of her meditation, to simply sit regardless of what was happening internally. This practice of non-judgment began extending into her work life. When she made a clinical decision that turned out to be wrong, instead of spiraling into self-criticism, she could acknowledge the mistake, learn from it, and move forward. When she lost a patient despite her best efforts, instead of taking it as personal failure, she could feel the natural sadness while recognizing that death was sometimes inevitable, regardless of intervention. Her relationship with Drew improved significantly as well. The armor she'd been wearing started to soften, allowing genuine intimacy and vulnerability. They began attending a weekly meditation group together at a Zen center in Newtown, sitting side by side in silence, then sharing tea and conversation with the Sangha afterward. Drew noticed that Isla laughed more, seemed more present when they spent time together, less haunted by work stress. She could actually relax on her days off, go to the beach without mentally reviewing cases, enjoy a meal without that background tension that had become her constant companion. The teacher at the Zen Center, a woman named Patricia who'd practiced for 30 years, shared teachings that deepened Isla's understanding. One evening, Patricia spoke about the koan. What is your original face before your parents were born? She explained that this question points beyond all our acquired identities, all the roles we play, to something more fundamental. Before you became a doctor, before you learned to be tough and professional, before all the conditioning and trauma, what were you? The question isn't asking for a conceptual answer, but inviting direct recognition of your true nature, the awareness that's been present throughout your entire life, unchanged by all the experiences that have come and gone. Isla sat with this koan during her meditation practice, holding the question lightly in awareness. She began to recognize that beneath her identity as doctor, as partner, as all her various roles, there was simple awareness, consciousness itself, present and unchanging. The traumatic cases she'd witnessed, the patients she'd lost, the stress and burnout she'd experienced, all of this had arisen in awareness and passed through it. But the awareness itself remained unmarked, like sky holding weather without being damaged by storms. This recognition didn't eliminate the difficulty of her work, but it gave her a stable ground to return to, a sense of self that wasn't defined by her professional successes or failures. Patricia told a teaching story about a doctor in ancient China who studied Zen under a master while maintaining his medical practice. One day he came to the master in distress, saying he'd lost 3 patients that week despite his best efforts and was questioning whether he should continue practicing medicine. The master asked him, "When a patient comes to you sick, do you cause their sickness?" "No." The doctor replied, "When a patient dies despite your treatment, do you cause their death?" "No." The doctor said, "Their illness or injuries cause the death. Then why?" The master asked, "Do you take credit when patients recover and blame when they die? You are not the cause of either outcome. You are simply a conduit, offering your skill and care to whatever situation arises. Let go of taking ownership of results you don't control." The teaching helped Isla understand how much unnecessary suffering she'd been creating by personalizing outcomes that were beyond her control. She'd take credit internally when she saved someone, using it to validate her competence. And she'd blame herself when someone died, using it as evidence of inadequacy. But both responses came from the same ego-driven pattern of making everything about her rather than simply being of service to whatever arose. When she could let go of this pattern, when she could show up with skill and care without needing specific outcomes to validate her worth, the work became more sustainable. She was learning what Zen calls great effort with no trace, giving everything while leaving no residue of self-importance or self-blame. 6 months into her practice, Isla had an experience during meditation that shifted something fundamental. She was sitting at home early in the morning, practicing shikantaza, when the sense of being a separate self, observing her experience, suddenly dissolved. There was no Isla watching her breath, just breathing happening. Awareness, aware of itself, with no one separate doing the observing. Sounds arose. Sensations arose. Thoughts arose. All appearing in consciousness with no one to whom they appeared. The recognition lasted perhaps a minute before thought reasserted itself, trying to grasp and understand what had happened, which immediately ended the experience. But that brief glimpse showed her what the Zen teachings had been pointing toward all along, that the separate self she'd been defending and protecting and trying to validate was actually a construct, a useful fiction for navigating daily life, but not ultimately real. Current word count, approximately 10. 650 words. Isla didn't try to recreate the experience or make it into something special. Patricia had warned against this trap. Getting attached to peak moments and spending your practice chasing them. The value of such glimpses, Patricia said, is simply showing you what's possible. What's already true beneath the usual sense of separate self. But they're not the goal. The goal is continuing to practice whether you're having profound insights or dealing with mundane restlessness. Bringing the same quality of presence to ordinary moments as to extraordinary ones. True Zen, she said, is not about collecting spiritual experiences, but about being fully present with whatever is, which includes the boring, the difficult, the completely ordinary. This teaching proved valuable when Isla went through a period of what Patricia called post-Kensho karmic backlash, where old patterns reasserted themselves with renewed force. After the glimpse of no self, Isla expected her practice to deepen steadily, the path to become easier. Instead, she found herself more reactive than before, old defenses springing up more intensely, as if her ego was fighting back against its own dissolution. She became frustrated with patients, irritable with colleagues, distant from Drew. The meditation that had seemed so valuable began to feel pointless. She considered quitting the practice altogether, convinced she'd been fooling herself about any progress. Patricia normalized this experience when Isla shared it during a private meeting. She explained that the spiritual path isn't a straight line of steady improvement, but a spiral, where you encounter the same patterns and challenges at deeper levels. The glimpse of no self had threatened the ego structure, which was now desperately trying to reassert control. This was a crucial phase in practice, she said, where you had to continue sitting and being present even when it felt like you were going backward. Even when the practice seemed to have stopped working, the willingness to show up during these dry, difficult periods was actually more valuable than having profound experiences during the easy times. Isla kept practicing. Though without much enthusiasm, she sat each morning because it was what she did, not because it felt good or produced results. She attended the weekly Sangha meetings because she'd committed to it, not because she felt inspired. And gradually, over weeks and months, the reactivity began to settle. She wasn't having profound insights, but she was developing a kind of patient endurance, a willingness to be present with her actual experience rather than needing it to be special or transformative. This patient endurance, Patricia said, was the real fruit of Zen practice, a quality that sustained you through difficulties without needing constant rewards or validation. Isla began to understand what the Zen masters meant when they talked about ordinary mind is the way. The bliss she'd been seeking wasn't some elevated spiritual state, but simple presence with ordinary reality. Walking to her car after a shift, feeling the evening air, seeing the sunset coloring the sky. This simple sensory experience was complete in itself, needed nothing added. Eating breakfast with Drew on a Saturday morning, tasting the food, hearing his voice, feeling connected. This too was complete. The moments of profound insight were valuable in showing her what was possible, but the real practice was learning to find completeness in the utterly ordinary, the unspectacular, the everyday moments that actually made up most of life. 2 years into her practice, Isla made a significant change at work. She reduced her hours, going from full-time to 3/4 time, taking a substantial pay cut in the process. Her colleagues were surprised, asking if she was okay, if something was wrong, but Isla explained that she was actually better than she'd been in years. She still loved emergency medicine, still found the work meaningful, but she'd recognized that working full-time was unsustainable, was slowly destroying her well-being and her relationship. The extra day off each week gave her time to rest genuinely, to practice meditation more deeply, to be present with Drew, to have a life outside the hospital. The financial sacrifice was worth it for the preservation of her sanity and her capacity to show up as a whole human being rather than a burned-out shell. This decision reflected a deeper shift in her values. She'd spent her entire career measuring herself by professional achievement, by how many patients she saved, how competent she appeared to colleagues, how dedicated she was to the work. The Zen practice had helped her recognize that this constant striving for validation was exhausting and ultimately futile. She could work less, achieve less by conventional measures, and actually be more effective in the hours she did work because she wasn't operating from a place of depletion and desperation. She'd learned what the teachings meant by effortless effort, giving her best without the strain of trying to prove something, responding to what each situation required without making it about her own adequacy. Patricia shared a final teaching that helped Isla integrate everything she'd learned. She told the group about Dogen's teaching that to study the self is to forget the self. Most people spend their lives obsessed with themselves, trying to improve themselves, protect themselves, validate themselves, constantly checking how they're doing and how they appear to others. This self-preoccupation creates immense suffering, a constant background anxiety about whether you're good enough, whether you're doing it right, whether you measure up. The path of Zen is learning to forget this anxious self-concern through complete absorption in whatever you're doing. When you're truly washing dishes, you forget yourself. When you're truly listening to someone, you forget yourself. When you're truly present with a patient, you forget yourself. And in that forgetting, you find freedom. Isla recognized this as what happened during her best moments at work. When she was completely focused on treating a critical patient, she disappeared into the action. No self-consciousness, no anxiety about performance, just complete presence and response to what was needed. Those were the moments when she was most effective and most at peace. The suffering came when she stepped back into self-consciousness, starting to worry about whether she was doing it right, whether others approved, whether she measured up. The practice was learning to drop into that selfless presence more often, to forget herself through complete engagement with whatever was arising, to find the bliss that comes not from self-improvement but from self-forgetting. Current word count, approximately 12. 550 words. In Nashville, Tennessee, a man named Mason worked as a chef and co-owner of a small restaurant in the Germantown neighborhood. He was 37 years old and had spent the last decade building his culinary career, working grueling hours in professional kitchens, climbing from line cook to sous chef, to eventually opening his own place with a business partner. The restaurant had earned good reviews, developed a loyal following, and was financially stable after 3 difficult years. From the outside, Mason had achieved his dream, but inside, he felt trapped by his own success, prisoner to the very thing he'd worked so hard to create. The restaurant demanded everything from him. He worked 6 days a week, arriving before noon to prep and leaving after midnight when the last customer was served and the kitchen was clean. He had no time for relationships, barely saw his friends, hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years. His entire life had become about the restaurant, about maintaining quality, about keeping customers happy, about staying ahead of competition. He'd started cooking because he loved the creative process, the alchemy of transforming raw ingredients into something beautiful and nourishing. But the joy had been ground down by the relentless pressure, the endless repetition, the exhaustion that had become his baseline state. What troubled Mason most was recognizing that he'd created this prison himself. Nobody forced him to work these hours or maintain these standards. He was doing it to himself, driven by some internalized belief that anything less than complete dedication meant failure. His business partner Simone had suggested multiple times that they hire another sous chef to share the workload. But Mason resisted, convinced that only he could maintain the quality the restaurant was known for. He was indispensable, which meant he was also trapped, unable to step away even briefly without fearing everything would fall apart. One Sunday, his only day off, Mason was walking through Centennial Park trying to clear his head when he came across a group practicing Tai Chi near the Parthenon. Something about their slow, deliberate movements caught his attention. They moved with complete focus and presence. No rush, no strain, just fluid motion that seemed effortless. Mason stood watching for several minutes, mesmerized by the quality of attention they brought to simple movements. When the practice ended, an older man from the group approached him and asked if he'd like to join them next Sunday. Mason found himself saying yes without really thinking about it. The following week, Mason showed up at the park and learned the basic Tai Chi forms from the teacher, a Chinese man in his 70s named Mr. Zhang. The movements were simple but surprisingly difficult to execute properly. Mason's mind kept racing ahead, trying to anticipate the next position rather than being fully present with the current one. Mr. Zhang would gently correct him, saying, "Don't think the movement, be the movement." Mason didn't fully understand what this meant, but he kept coming back, finding something peaceful in the Sunday morning practice that contrasted sharply with the chaos of his restaurant week. After several weeks, Mr. Zhang invited Mason to tea at his home, a small apartment filled with books and scrolls. They sat in Mr. Zhang's modest kitchen drinking green tea, while the old man talked about the philosophy behind Tai Chi, how it came from Taoist and Zen principles of moving in harmony with natural flow rather than forcing things through effort and strain. He talked about Wu Wei, effortless action, where you accomplish things by aligning with the natural way rather than through struggle and resistance. Mason listened, intrigued but skeptical. In his world, everything required intense effort and vigilance. The idea of effortless action seemed like a fantasy. Mr. Zhang must have sensed his skepticism because he told Mason a teaching story. There was once a butcher so skilled that his knife never needed sharpening despite cutting thousands of animals over 30 years. When asked his secret, the butcher said that he didn't cut through the meat, but found the spaces between joints and tendons, allowing the knife to glide through naturally. Cooks who hacked and forced their way through had to replace their knives monthly because they were fighting against the natural structure. But the master butcher worked with the structure, finding the path of least resistance, accomplishing his task with minimal effort and maximum grace. Mason immediately thought about his own work in the kitchen. He attacked his tasks with force and intensity, muscling through the work, fighting against time and tiredness. What if there was another way? What if he could find the natural flow of kitchen work rather than constantly battling it? Mr. Zhang suggested that Mason might benefit from sitting meditation as well as the movement practice, that learning to still the mind would help him find the spaces in his work where effortless action became possible. He recommended a Zen center nearby that offered meditation instruction. Mason started attending evening meditation sessions at the Zen center when his restaurant was closed on Mondays. The practice was challenging in different ways than Tai Chi. Sitting still for 30 minutes. His body screamed with discomfort. His mind raced with thoughts about menus and staffing and food costs. But the teacher, a woman named Anne who'd practiced for 20 years, emphasized that meditation wasn't about achieving some peaceful state. It was simply about being present with whatever was arising, comfortable or uncomfortable, pleasant or unpleasant, without trying to change it. This radical acceptance of present experience was foreign to Mason, whose entire life was about changing things, improving things, making things better. Anne taught about the Zen concept of beginner's mind, approaching each moment with fresh openness rather than assumption and habit. In beginner's mind, she said, even the most familiar task becomes new and interesting because you're actually present with it, rather than operating on autopilot. Mason realized he'd been cooking on autopilot for years, going through familiar motions without really experiencing them. The joy had disappeared because he'd stopped being present with the actual process, lost in thoughts about outcomes and performance. What if he could bring beginner's mind to his work? Approaching each dish as if cooking it for the first time, present with the colors and textures and smells, rather than just executing a routine. Current word count, approximately 13. 500 words. Mason started experimenting with this approach in his kitchen. During prep work, instead of rushing through chopping vegetables while mentally planning the evening service, he'd bring complete attention to the knife work itself, feeling the blade moving through carrots, seeing the colors, noticing the textures. At first, this felt slower and more cumbersome, but he discovered that when he was fully present, the work actually flowed more efficiently because he wasn't making the small mistakes that came from distraction, cutting himself less often, wasting less product, finding a rhythm that felt natural rather than forced. The tasks he'd experienced as drudgery for years became oddly satisfying when he brought genuine presence to them. Anne shared a teaching about Zen Master Dogen's instruction to students working in the monastery kitchen. He told them to handle even a single vegetable with the same care and attention they would bring to serving the Buddha himself. Not because vegetables were sacred in some mystical sense, but because each moment, each task, deserves your complete presence and respect. When you cook with this quality of attention, she said, the food tastes different. People can sense the care and presence that went into preparing it, even if they can't name what they're tasting. Mason thought this sounded mystical and impractical, but he decided to test it. For 1 week, Mason brought complete meditative presence to his cooking, treating each ingredient with genuine care, giving his full attention to every step of preparation and plating. He stopped multitasking, stopped letting his mind race ahead to the next order, simply focused on the dish in front of him. Several regular customers commented that week that the food seemed even better than usual, asking if he'd changed recipes. He hadn't changed anything except his presence, his attention, the quality of awareness he brought to the work. This experience showed him what the Zen teachings meant about ordinary mind being the way. The transformation wasn't in the external techniques, but in the internal quality of attention and care. Mason's relationship with his staff began to change as well. Previously, he'd been demanding and critical, pushing people hard, snapping when they made mistakes. The kitchen had high turnover, with young cooks lasting only a few months before burning out or quitting. Mason told himself this was just how professional kitchens operated, intense and unforgiving. But his Zen practice was revealing how much unnecessary suffering he created through his approach. When he could be present with his own stress and frustration rather than immediately dumping it on his staff. When he could respond to mistakes with teaching rather than anger. The kitchen atmosphere shifted. People seemed more relaxed, made fewer errors, stayed longer, and told a teaching story about a Zen monastery where the head cook was renowned for running the most peaceful kitchen anyone had experienced. Visitors expected to find some secret technique or special system, but when they observed, they saw just ordinary kitchen work. The difference was that the cook never hurried, never forced, never created unnecessary drama. When things went wrong, he adjusted calmly. When demand was high, he worked steadily without panic. His peace came not from controlling circumstances, but from accepting whatever arose and responding with wisdom rather than reactivity. His calm presence influenced everyone around him, creating an environment where people could work effectively without constant stress. Mason recognized himself as the opposite of this peaceful cook. He'd been creating drama and urgency even when situations didn't require it, operating from a belief that intensity equaled dedication. But he was learning that genuine effectiveness came from clarity and presence, not from stress and forcing. Over several months, as his meditation practice deepened, the kitchen culture gradually transformed. He hired the additional sous chef Simone had been suggesting for years, letting go of his conviction that only he could maintain quality. To his surprise, sharing responsibility actually improved the food because he was less exhausted and could bring better attention to his own work. Mr. Zhang invited Mason to attend a weekend Zen retreat in the Smoky Mountains, a period of intensive meditation practice in silence. Mason was nervous about taking time away from the restaurant, but Simone encouraged him to go, saying the place would survive fine without him for a weekend. The retreat was held at a small monastery, simple wooden buildings nestled in the forest. Participants sat in meditation for hours each day, walked slowly through the woods, ate meals in silence, attended teachings from the resident teacher. The schedule was demanding in its own way, but different from the restaurant's intensity, more spacious, less driven. During one afternoon sitting session, Mason experienced something that shifted his understanding profoundly. He'd been watching his breath, noticing thoughts arising and passing, when suddenly the sense of being someone watching dissolved completely. There was just breathing, just awareness. No separate Mason, observing it all. The mountain sounds, bird song, wind in trees, arose in consciousness with no one to whom they occurred. This recognition lasted perhaps a minute before thought reasserted itself. But in that minute, Mason touched what the Zen teachings called his true nature, the awareness that existed before all his stories about being a stressed chef, before all his identities and roles. Simple and complete in itself, the experience didn't solve his problems or transform him into an enlightened being. When he returned to Nashville and his restaurant, the stress and challenges remained, but something had shifted in his relationship to it all. He'd seen directly that his true nature wasn't the stressed, striving Mason, but the awareness in which stress and striving appeared. This awareness was never stressed, never tired, never inadequate, simply present and spacious regardless of what moved through it. He couldn't maintain constant access to this recognition, but knowing it was there gave him a reference point to return to, a reminder that he was more than his most stressed and contracted states. Anne taught about the Zen principle of nothing special, which Mason was beginning to understand through experience. Enlightenment, awakening, Buddha nature. All these pointed to something utterly ordinary that became extraordinary only when you stopped overlooking it. Chopping vegetables with complete presence, feeling the knife in your hand, seeing the colors and shapes. This simple sensory experience was complete in itself, was the bliss he'd been seeking through success and recognition. Walking through his neighborhood on a rare evening off, feeling the humid Tennessee air, seeing fireflies in the dusk, hearing music from the honky-tonks on Broadway. This too was complete, needed nothing added. Mason reduced his work hours, finally trusting his sous chef and staff to maintain quality without his constant oversight. He started taking Sundays completely off, not just from physical work, but from thinking about work, spending the day in Tai Chi practice, meditation, and simply being present with his life outside the restaurant. His business partner Simone noticed the change, remarked that he seemed more himself than he'd been in years, more creative in his cooking, more enjoyable to work with. The restaurant continued to thrive, arguably better than when Mason had been controlling every detail through force of will. One evening, Mason was plating a dish during dinner service when he noticed he was completely absorbed in the task. No separation between himself and the work. Just cooking happening through him without effort or strain. His hands moved efficiently, arranging components with care and precision. But there was no Mason doing it, just the activity itself arising naturally. This was what Mr. Zhang had meant by effortless action, what Anne called Zen in action. He wasn't trying to be present or perform perfectly. He'd simply disappeared into the work. And in that disappearance, he found the bliss that had eluded him through all his striving and forcing. Mason understood now what the ancient Zen masters had discovered. That awakening doesn't require leaving your ordinary life or achieving some special state. It's found in complete presence with whatever you're doing. Whether washing dishes or cooking a meal or sitting in meditation, the path isn't about becoming someone extraordinary, but about being completely ordinary, fully here, awake to the simple miracle of existence that's been present all along, hidden only by our constant reaching for something else. He'd learned that pure bliss isn't created through achievement or acquisition, but revealed when you stop looking elsewhere and simply be with what is, exactly as it is, complete and whole in every moment. In Chicago, Illinois, a woman named Sophie worked as a classical violinist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. She was 29 years old and had dedicated her entire life to music, practicing since age 4, attending prestigious conservatories, winning competitions, finally achieving her dream position in one of the world's great orchestras. But sitting in her apartment in Wicker Park after a rehearsal, Sophie felt a despair she couldn't name. The music that had once filled her with joy now felt mechanical and empty. She went through the motions perfectly, hit every note precisely. But something essential was missing. She was performing music without actually experiencing it, executing technical perfection while feeling nothing. The crisis had been building for months, but came to a head during a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Sophie sat in the second violin section, playing her part flawlessly, surrounded by the massive sound of orchestra and chorus. Music that should have been transcendent and moving, but she felt completely disconnected, like she was watching herself perform from a distance, going through memorized motions without any genuine connection to the beauty being created. When the performance ended to thunderous applause, Sophie felt nothing but relief that it was over. She realized with horror that she'd lost her love for the very thing she'd built her entire life around. After that performance, Sophie couldn't bring herself to practice. She'd pick up her violin and stand there holding it, unable to make herself play. Her technique remained perfect when she had to perform, but it felt like a trained response rather than genuine expression. She considered quitting music entirely, but the thought terrified her. Who would she be without her violin? Her entire identity was wrapped up in being a musician. Without that, she was nothing. She felt trapped between continuing a path that felt dead and empty, or abandoning the only thing she knew how to do. One afternoon, Sophie was walking through Millennium Park trying to clear her head when she heard someone playing flute near the Cloud Gate sculpture. The sound was simple, just a folk melody, but something about it caught her attention. The musician was an older woman sitting on a bench, eyes closed, completely absorbed in playing. Sophie stood listening, and she realized what had captured her attention. The woman was playing with complete presence and joy, not performing for anyone, just making music for the pure pleasure of it. When the woman finished and opened her eyes, she smiled at Sophie. They started talking, and Sophie found herself confessing her crisis to this stranger. The woman, whose name was Margaret, told Sophie she'd been a professional musician herself years ago, had faced a similar crisis, and had discovered Zen Buddhism as a way to reconnect with the genuine love of music beneath all the performance pressure and technical perfection. She invited Sophie to a session at a Zen center in Lincoln Park, where musicians and artists practiced meditation together. Sophie went, skeptical but desperate. The teacher, a jazz pianist named David who'd practiced Zen for 30 years, taught them about Shoshin, beginner's mind. He said that expertise often kills genuine experience because you stop actually listening or seeing or feeling, operating instead from memory and habit. The practice was learning to approach even the most familiar music as if encountering it for the first time, fresh and new. David had them do a simple exercise, play a single note on their instruments with complete attention, as if it were the most important sound in the universe. Sophie felt ridiculous doing this, playing one open string and holding it. But as she listened with genuine attention, she heard things she'd never noticed before. The complexity of harmonics, the way the sound changed moment by moment, the beauty in this single tone. David said that when you can find the infinite in a single note, when you can be completely present with the simplest sound, you rediscover why music matters. The technique serves the music, but the music serves presence, serves the direct experience of beauty and aliveness that exists in every moment when you're fully awake to it. Over the following months, Sophie rebuilt her relationship with music from the ground up. She practiced meditation daily, learning to be present with sounds rather than immediately judging or analyzing them. She started playing simple folk songs and hymns with complete attention rather than rushing to master technically difficult pieces. She joined an amateur chamber group that played just for joy. No performances, no pressure, just the pleasure of making music together. Gradually, the love returned. Not because she became less skilled, but because she reconnected with genuine presence beneath all the expertise and performance anxiety. When Sophie returned to orchestra rehearsals, something had changed. She was still the same technically proficient violinist, but now she was actually listening, actually experiencing the music, actually present with the beauty being created rather than just executing her part mechanically. During a performance of Bach's Mass in B minor, Sophie felt tears on her face, moved by the music for the first time in years. She'd rediscovered what the Zen teachings called her original nature, the pure awareness that experienced beauty directly before all the concepts and judgments and performance anxiety obscured it. The bliss she'd been seeking through perfection and achievement had been available all along in simple presence with the music itself, which was itself just a gateway to presence with life, with existence, with the ordinary miracle of being aware and alive. David taught Sophie and the other musicians about a Zen approach to practice he called just playing. Most musicians, he said, practice with intense goal orientation, always trying to fix mistakes. Perfect technique. Prepare for performances. This creates a relationship to music based on inadequacy and striving, where you're never good enough as you are. Just playing meant approaching your instrument with no agenda, no trying to improve or achieve anything, simply making sound for the pure experience of it. He had them sit in meditation for 20 minutes first, settling into present awareness, then pick up their instruments and play whatever arose naturally, without judgment about whether it was good or bad, sophisticated or simple. Sophie found this practice profoundly uncomfortable at first. Her entire musical training had been about discipline, structure, working towards specific goals. Playing without any objective felt aimless and pointless. But David encouraged her to notice the resistance, to see how uncomfortable it was to simply be with music without using it to prove something or accomplish something. That discomfort, he said, was revealing how much she'd been using music as a tool for validation rather than experiencing it directly. Over weeks of this practice, Sophie began to find moments where she could just play, letting sounds emerge without immediately judging them, experiencing music as pure sensation and beauty rather than as performance. David shared a teaching story about a famous concert pianist who'd studied with a Zen master. The pianist complained that despite his technical mastery, his performances felt hollow, that he couldn't move audiences the way truly great pianists did. The Zen master asked him to play something simple, just a folk melody. The pianist played it perfectly, with sophisticated technique and nuanced interpretation. The master shook his head and said the pianist was trying too hard to be profound, that he was performing his idea of how the music should sound rather than letting the music itself speak. He told the pianist to play the same melody again, but this time to play it as if he were a child hearing it for the first time. With wonder and simplicity, the pianist tried again, and something shifted. He stopped trying to demonstrate his sophistication and simply played the notes, present with each sound, letting the melody be what it was without adding layers of interpretation. The master smiled and said, now the music was alive. Now it could touch hearts, because the pianist had gotten out of the way and let the music be music, rather than using it as a vehicle for self-expression. The teaching was that genuine artistry comes not from adding more technique or sophistication, but from removing yourself enough to let the art speak directly, to be a clear channel, rather than constantly inserting your ego into the process. Sophie recognized herself in this story. She'd been performing her idea of how music should sound, using her technical skill to demonstrate competence rather than actually listening and responding to what the music itself needed. She started experimenting with removing herself from the equation, approaching pieces with the question, what does this music want? rather than how can I perform this impressively. The shift was subtle but profound. In orchestra rehearsals, instead of focusing on her own part in isolation, she began listening to how her line fit into the larger whole, responding to what she heard from other sections, allowing her playing to be shaped by the living musical conversation rather than by her predetermined interpretation. Her stand partner noticed the change, remarked that Sophie seemed more present, more engaged with the ensemble rather than just executing her own part. The concertmaster, during a break in rehearsal, mentioned that the second violin section sounded more cohesive, more musical. Sophie didn't take credit or explain what had changed. She simply continued practicing presence, continued learning to get out of the way and let music happen through her rather than trying to make music happen through force of will. She understood this was what the Zen teachings meant by effortless action. Not passivity or laziness, but complete engagement without the strain of trying to control outcomes. Sophie's meditation practice deepened as well. She began sitting for longer periods, attending weekend retreats at the Zen Center, working with David in occasional private meetings. During one session, an intensive meditation retreat, Sophie had an experience that transformed her understanding completely. She was sitting in the meditation hall, aware of her breathing, when suddenly the boundary between herself and the sounds around her dissolved. There was no Sophie listening to sounds, just hearing happening. Awareness, aware of itself, with no separation between perceiver and perceived. A bird sang outside, and the sound arose in consciousness as intimately as her own thoughts. No distance, no separation. The experience lasted perhaps 2 minutes before her thinking mind reasserted itself. But those 2 minutes showed her what the Zen masters meant by non-duality. After the retreat, Sophie met with David to discuss the experience. He acknowledged it as Kensho, seeing one's true nature, but warned her against getting attached to it or trying to recreate it. These glimpses are valuable, he said, in showing you what's possible, what's actually true, beneath the usual sense of separation. But they're not the goal. The goal is bringing this recognition into everyday life, into your music, into ordinary moments. Can you wash dishes with the same non-dual awareness you touched in meditation? Can you play violin recognizing that there's no separate Sophie performing but just music arising in consciousness? That integration is the real practice, not collecting peak experiences. Current word count, approximately 900 words. Sophie began bringing this practice of non-separation into her performing. During concerts, instead of experiencing herself as a separate person playing violin, she'd relax into the awareness that there was just music happening. Sounds arising in consciousness, with no one separate doing the performing. This wasn't a technique she could force, but a recognition that sometimes occurred when she stopped trying so hard, when she got out of her own way completely. In those moments, her playing had a quality of spontaneity and freshness that transcended anything she could achieve through deliberate effort. Other musicians in the orchestra noticed, though they couldn't name what was different. Several colleagues asked if she'd been working with a new teacher or practicing differently. Sophie began teaching violin to a few private students, something she'd avoided before because she'd felt she didn't have anything genuine to offer beyond technical instruction. But now she found herself teaching not just finger positions and bowing techniques, but presence, listening, the quality of attention that brings music to life. With beginners, instead of drilling scales mechanically, she'd have them play a single note with complete attention, discovering the beauty in the simplest sound. With more advanced students struggling with difficult passages, she'd teach them to relax into the music rather than attacking it with force, to find the natural flow within the technical challenges. One of her students was a teenage girl named Emily, who reminded Sophie of her younger self. Technically gifted but anxious and perfectionistic, measuring her worth by how well she performed. Sophie watched Emily tense up before playing, saw the self-judgment in her face when she made mistakes, recognized the pattern she'd lived with for years. She started teaching Emily basic meditation along with violin, having her sit for 5 minutes before lessons to settle into present awareness, teaching her to notice when the inner critic arose and to relate to it with gentle distance rather than belief. Emily was skeptical at first, but gradually began to relax, to find more joy in playing, to make music rather than just demonstrating technique. David shared a teaching with the musicians' meditation group about the difference between two Japanese aesthetic concepts: ki, skill that comes from long practice, and mu, the mind of no mind that allows spontaneous response beyond technique. Great musicians, he said, develop both. They practice diligently for years, building technical mastery that becomes second nature. But then they must go beyond technique, letting go of conscious control and allowing music to play through them. This is what jazz musicians call being in the zone, what athletes call flow, what Zen calls mushin, the mind of no mind. You can't force it to happen, but you can create conditions for it by practicing technique until it's unconscious, then getting out of the way and trusting what emerges. He told them about a famous jazz pianist who'd practiced scales and exercises for hours every day for decades, building extraordinary technical facility. But when he performed, he never thought about technique. He'd enter a state of complete presence where his hands moved spontaneously, responding to what he heard from other musicians, following the music wherever it wanted to go. When asked how he did this, he said he practiced technique religiously so that in performance he could forget it completely, so his conscious mind could step aside and let something larger play through him. This wasn't mystical, David explained, but a natural result of practice meeting presence. Skill, meeting, surrender. Sophie recognized this as what happened in her best performances now. When years of technical training combined with meditative presence to create something beyond what she could consciously control, the music would flow through her with a quality of inevitability, each note arising exactly as it needed to without deliberate choice. These moments couldn't be forced or manufactured, but they occurred more frequently as her practice deepened, as she learned to trust the process rather than trying to control every detail. She understood this was the bliss the Zen teachings pointed toward. Not some special altered state, but the natural flow of life when you stop obstructing it with ego and effort. 2 years into her Zen practice, Sophie was invited to perform a solo recital at a small venue in Evanston. She chose a program of Bach unaccompanied works, music that required complete technical command but also deep interpretive understanding. As she prepared for the performance, she noticed her relationship to the anxiety was different than it would have been years earlier. The nervousness still arose, the familiar butterflies and racing thoughts, but she could hold it in larger awareness, recognize it as just physical and mental weather passing through consciousness, not something that defined her or needed to be eliminated. She could be anxious and still centered, afraid and still present. The night of the recital, Sophie sat backstage practicing meditation before going on. She felt the anxiety, acknowledged it, let it be present without fighting it. When she walked on stage and sat down with her violin, she took a moment to simply be present, feeling her feet on the floor, seeing the audience, aware of the space. Then she began playing, and for the entire 70-minute program, she was completely absorbed in the music. There was no Sophie worrying about mistakes or trying to impress anyone, just sound arising in consciousness, each phrase emerging from silence and returning to silence, the whole performance flowing like a single continuous breath. When she finished and the audience applauded, Sophie felt a completeness that had nothing to do with how well she'd played technically. She'd been fully present, fully alive to each moment, and that presence was its own reward, regardless of the outcome. Several audience members came up afterwards saying it was the most moving performance of Bach they'd heard, that something about her playing had touched them deeply. Sophie thanked them genuinely, but knew that what they'd responded to wasn't her skill or interpretation, but the quality of presence she'd brought. The transparency that had allowed the music to speak directly without the interference of ego. David attended the recital and told Sophie afterward that she'd found what the Zen teachings call original music, the sound that exists before technique and interpretation, the direct expression of being that flows naturally when you stop trying to be someone impressive. He said this was why people had been moved, not because of sophisticated musicianship, but because they'd sensed genuine presence, genuine aliveness, something real beneath all the layers of performance and pretense that usually characterize classical music concerts. Sophie had learned to play from her original nature rather than from her ideas about how she should play, and that authenticity was what allowed the music to actually touch hearts. Current word count, approximately 16,800 words. Sophie's life continued to transform in quieter ways that weren't visible from the outside. She maintained her position in the orchestra, still showed up for rehearsals and performances, still practiced daily, but the quality of her engagement had fundamentally shifted. Music was no longer something she used to validate herself or prove her worth. It was simply what she did, an expression of presence and aliveness, meaningful in itself, regardless of recognition or success. She found herself genuinely enjoying rehearsals, appreciating the collective process of creating beauty with other musicians, no longer obsessed with her own part or how she compared to others. Her student Emily made remarkable progress, not just technically, but in her relationship to music and to herself. The anxious, perfectionistic teenager gradually became more relaxed, more willing to take risks, more able to play with genuine expression rather than just demonstrating competence. Emily's parents noticed the change, asked Sophie what she was teaching beyond violin. Sophie explained about the meditation practice, the emphasis on presence and listening, the understanding that music serves life rather than life serving music. Emily's mother said that whatever Sophie was doing, it was transforming not just Emily's playing but her whole approach to challenges, her ability to stay centered under pressure. David invited Sophie to help lead the musicians' meditation group, to share her experience with others struggling with similar issues around performance, anxiety, and creative blocks. Sophie was hesitant, feeling like a beginner herself. But David insisted that teaching is one of the best ways to deepen your own understanding. Sophie began co-facilitating sessions, sharing honestly about her journey from mechanical perfection to genuine presence, from using music to prove worth to experiencing music as direct expression of aliveness. Other musicians resonated with her story, grateful to hear someone acknowledge the suffering that often accompanies professional musicianship, the way achievement and recognition can actually distance you from the joy that drew you to art in the first place. One evening, At the meditation group, a young cellist asked Sophie how to balance the discipline required for professional music with the Zen teaching about letting go and being present. Wasn't music inherently about striving, about working toward mastery? Sophie thought about this carefully before responding. She said that there's a difference between genuine practice and desperate striving. Genuine practice comes from love of the activity itself, from the joy of engagement, from wanting to develop your capacity to serve beauty. Desperate striving comes from trying to prove something, from needing achievement to validate yourself, from making your worth conditional on results. You can practice with tremendous discipline and dedication while still approaching each moment with presence and acceptance, without the overlay of self-judgment and grasping. She told them about a conversation she'd had with David, where he explained the difference between attainment practice and expression practice. Attainment practice is working towards some future goal, some state you'll achieve if you practice correctly and long enough. This creates constant dissatisfaction because you're always reaching for something not yet present. Expression practice is allowing each moment of practice to be complete in itself. Practicing not to become something, but to express what you already are. To manifest your Buddha nature through whatever activity you're engaged in. When you practice violin with this understanding, every note is complete. Every practice session is valuable in itself, not just as preparation for some future achievement. The cellist nodded, beginning to understand. Sophie could see the young woman's shoulders relax, the tight expression around her eyes soften. She recognized her younger self in this musician, the one who'd been strangling the joy out of music through desperate striving. She felt grateful to be able to offer what she'd learned, to perhaps spare others some of the suffering she'd experienced. This was what David meant when he said that teaching deepens your own practice. In articulating these understandings for others, Sophie clarified them for herself, integrated them more fully into her own life. Sophie also began exploring composition, something she'd never attempted before. She'd always thought of herself as an interpreter of others' music, never a creator. But her Zen practice had opened a curiosity about what might emerge if she approached composition with beginner's mind, without trying to create something impressive or prove her creativity. She started writing simple melodies, allowing them to arise without forcing, trusting whatever emerged. The pieces were modest, nothing revolutionary, but they had a quality of honesty and directness that pleased her. She wasn't trying to be a great composer, just exploring sound and expression, enjoying the creative process itself. David taught about the Zen concept of skillful means, using whatever works to wake people up to their true nature. For some people, formal sitting meditation is the path. For others, it might be music, cooking, gardening, raising children, any activity approached with complete presence and attention. The activity itself isn't sacred, but the quality of awareness you bring to it can reveal the sacred dimension of ordinary existence. Music, he said, is particularly powerful as skillful means because sound has this quality of arising from silence and returning to silence. A natural teaching about impermanence and emptiness that you can experience directly without conceptual understanding. Sophie had a profound experience of this during a performance of Arvo Pärt's Spiegel, I Am Spiegel, a minimalist piece of extraordinary simplicity and beauty, playing the slowly unfolding melodic line. She experienced each note as arising from infinite silence, existing briefly, then dissolving back into silence. The music became a teaching about the nature of all phenomena, everything arising from emptiness, existing briefly in conditioned form, then returning to emptiness. She wasn't thinking about this conceptually during the performance, but experiencing it directly through the music itself. After that performance, she understood why David said music could be a complete spiritual path in itself. That you didn't need to sit in meditation if you could bring the same quality of presence and awareness to your musical practice. 3 years into her Zen practice, Sophie was offered a position teaching at a prestigious conservatory. The job would mean leaving the orchestra, transitioning from performer to teacher. A significant shift in identity. The old Sophie would have agonized over this decision, weighing pros and cons endlessly, worried about making the right choice. But she found herself able to hold the question lightly, to sit with the uncertainty without needing to force a resolution. She meditated on it, talked with David about it, but mostly just waited to see what felt true, rather than trying to figure out intellectually what she should do. Current word count: approximately 700 words. After several weeks of sitting with the question, Sophie realized the answer had already emerged. She genuinely wanted to teach, wanted to work with young musicians in the way David had worked with her, helping them find presence and authenticity beneath technique and achievement. The orchestra had been essential to her development, but she'd learned what she needed to learn there. It was time for a new expression, a new way of serving music and musicians. She accepted the teaching position with clarity and peace, trusting that this was the right move, even though she couldn't predict all the outcomes. Her farewell concert with the orchestra was emotionally rich. She'd spent 7 years in that violin section, grown tremendously both musically and personally during that time. But saying goodbye didn't feel like loss. It felt like natural transition. One chapter closing and another opening. She played her final concert with complete presence, grateful for every moment, for the music and the colleagues and the whole experience, while fully ready to move forward. This was what the Zen teachings meant by non-attachment. She realized, not coldness or indifference, but the ability to appreciate what's present while it's here and release it gracefully when it's time to move on. At the conservatory, Sophie taught violin technique, but also something harder to name. A quality of presence and authenticity that students sensed, even if they couldn't articulate it. Her studio quickly developed a reputation for producing musicians who were technically excellent, but also musically alive, who could perform with genuine expression rather than just demonstrating competence. Sophie emphasized listening over playing, presence over perfection, serving the music over impressing audiences. Some students thrived with this approach immediately. Others struggled, conditioned by years of achievement-oriented training to believe that music was about proving yourself rather than expressing aliveness. She started each lesson with a few minutes of meditation, having students settle into present awareness before picking up their instruments. Initially, some students resisted, seeing it as a waste of valuable lesson time. But over weeks and months, most came to appreciate how this practice transformed their playing, how they could access a different quality of music when they approached it from presence rather than anxiety. Sophie taught them what David had taught her. That meditation wasn't separate from musical practice, but was actually the foundation of genuine musicianship. The cultivation of awareness and presence that allowed music to flow naturally rather than being forced through effort. One of her students, a talented but anxious young man named Marcus, struggled terribly with performance anxiety. He'd freeze during auditions and competitions despite being technically superior to many who succeeded where he failed. Sophie worked with him not just on repertoire, but on his relationship to performing, teaching him to notice the anxiety without believing its catastrophic predictions. to stay grounded in his body and breath, even when fear arose, to remember that his worth as a person didn't depend on any particular performance outcome. Marcus made slow but genuine progress, learning to perform without being paralyzed by self-consciousness, finding moments of genuine presence even in high-pressure situations. Sophie shared with Marcus a teaching David had given her years ago about the Buddhist concept of great doubt. In Zen practice, great doubt isn't intellectual skepticism, but a profound not knowing, a willingness to sit with uncertainty without needing to resolve it prematurely. Performance anxiety, David had explained, comes from trying to know in advance how things will go, from needing certainty about outcomes before you're willing to act. The practice is developing the capacity to step into uncertain situations while remaining present and grounded, trusting your preparation and training while releasing attachment to specific results. This is what performers call letting go, what athletes call trusting the process, what Zen calls leaping from the 100-foot pole. Marcus struggled with this at first, his entire conditioning oriented toward controlling outcomes through more preparation and effort. But gradually, through meditation practice and Sophie's patient guidance, he began to develop the capacity to perform from not knowing, to step onto stage without needing to know in advance that he'd succeed, to trust his preparation while releasing attachment to specific outcomes. His playing became more spontaneous and alive, less constricted by fear. When he successfully auditioned for a position in a regional orchestra, he told Sophie that what made the difference wasn't better preparation, but the ability to stay present with uncertainty, to play from genuine presence rather than from desperate need to prove himself. Sophie continued her own meditation practice, sitting daily, attending retreats several times a year. 4 years into practice, she no longer had dramatic insights or profound experiences during meditation. Mostly she just sat, watching breath, noticing thoughts, being present. This ordinariness was itself the teaching. She realized enlightenment wasn't some special altered state, but simple presence with ordinary reality. The capacity to be completely here without needing anything special to happen. The bliss the Zen teachings promised wasn't extraordinary experience, but the deep satisfaction of being fully alive to each moment, appreciating the simple miracle of awareness itself. David taught about Dogen's understanding that practice and enlightenment aren't separate. You don't practice to achieve enlightenment at some future time. Practice itself is enlightenment, the expression of your already present Buddha nature. When you sit in meditation with no goal, that goalless sitting is enlightenment. When you play violin with complete presence, that's enlightenment. When you wash dishes with full attention, that's enlightenment. It's not some special state, but simply being completely here, completely present, completely yourself, without trying to be something impressive. This ordinariness, Dogen taught, is the most extraordinary thing, the direct expression of your original nature. Sophie understood this now, not conceptually but experientially, walking across campus between classes, feeling the sun on her face, seeing students rushing to their lessons, hearing distant sounds of practicing instruments. She experienced completeness that needed nothing added. This simple sensory awareness, this being present with ordinary reality, was the bliss she'd sought through achievement and recognition. It had been available all along, hidden only by her constant reaching for something else, something more impressive than simple presence with what is. Current word count, approximately 18. 600 words, 5 years into her teaching career. Sophie was invited to give a presentation at a music education conference about her approach to teaching presence and mindfulness alongside technical skill. Standing before a room of conservatory professors and professional musicians, she felt the familiar flutter of performance anxiety, but could hold it with equanimity, recognizing it as natural human response to public speaking rather than evidence of inadequacy. She spoke honestly about her own crisis years earlier, the way she'd lost connection to music through desperate striving for perfection, and how Zen practice had restored genuine relationship to her art. Many in the audience were skeptical, seeing meditation as New Age distraction from serious musical training, but others resonated deeply, acknowledging privately that they too felt disconnected from the joy that had originally drawn them to music, that they too struggled with performance anxiety and the sense that achievement brought no lasting satisfaction. Several teachers approached Sophie afterward asking for resources, wanting to explore this integration of contemplative practice and musical training. She gave them David's contact information, recommended books, invited them to visit her studio and observe how she worked with students. Sophie realized she was part of a growing movement of musicians and artists who were discovering contemplative practices as essential to creative work, not as addition to technique, but as foundation for genuine artistry. The old model of the tortured artist, suffering for their art, was giving way to understanding that presence and well-being actually enhanced creativity rather than diminishing it. You didn't need to be anxious and miserable to make great art. In fact, presence and peace allowed for deeper, more authentic expression than desperation and striving ever could. David invited Sophie to begin teaching meditation at the Zen Center, leading sessions specifically for artists and performers. She'd been assisting for years, but now would teach independently. Sophie felt the familiar imposter syndrome arise, the sense that she wasn't qualified, didn't know enough, wasn't enlightened enough to teach. But David reminded her that teaching in Zen isn't about being perfect or completely awakened. It's about sharing honestly what you've learned through practice, offering your experience without claiming to have all answers. The best teachers, he said, are those who acknowledge their ongoing struggles while pointing to what they've discovered that might help others. Sophie's meditation sessions attracted musicians, dancers, actors, visual artists, all dealing with similar issues around performance anxiety, creative blocks, the pressure to constantly produce impressive work. She taught them basic mindfulness meditation, walking meditation, loving kindness practice, but she also emphasized that meditation wasn't separate from their art, that bringing meditative presence to creative work was itself a complete practice. She had them do exercises like playing a single note with complete attention, painting a single brushstroke mindfully, dancing a simple gesture with full awareness. These practices revealed how presence transforms activity, how the simplest action becomes rich and satisfying when you're fully there for it. One evening, a young actress named Rachel shared that she'd been cast in a major role but was terrified of performing, convinced she'd freeze on stage and humiliate herself. Sophie recognized her younger self in Rachel's fear, the catastrophic thinking, the way anxiety spiraled into paralysis. She taught Rachel what she'd learned about working with fear, not trying to eliminate it but developing the capacity to be present with it, to feel the physical sensations without believing the catastrophic stories the mind generated. They practiced together, Rachel bringing awareness to the body, sensations of fear, noticing where she felt it, breathing into those areas, allowing the fear to be present without fighting it. Sophie shared a teaching from her own experience about the difference between fear and anxiety. Fear is the natural physiological response to perceived threat, useful for survival, temporary and specific. Anxiety is the mind's elaboration on fear, the endless storytelling about what might go wrong, the catastrophizing that creates suffering beyond any actual present danger. When you can separate the physical sensation of fear from the mental stories about fear, when you can feel the racing heart and butterflies without believing the predictions of disaster, you discover that fear itself is manageable, even energizing. It's the anxiety, the mental story, that's overwhelming. Rachel practiced this distinction, learning to notice when she was feeling actual fear versus when she was lost in catastrophic thinking. She discovered that the physical sensation of stage fright, while uncomfortable, wasn't actually unbearable when she stopped layering panic on top of it. She could feel the adrenaline, the racing heart, the nervous energy, and still perform, using that energy to fuel her performance rather than being paralyzed by it. When she successfully completed her run in the play, she told Sophie that meditation had given her the tools to work with fear rather than being controlled by it, to perform from presence even in the midst of nervousness. Sophie continued to integrate Zen teachings into every aspect of her life. Shopping for groceries. She practiced being present with the simple activity, seeing colors and shapes of vegetables, feeling the weight of items in her basket, engaging with cashiers as actual people rather than obstacles to efficiency. Doing laundry, she brought full attention to the task, folding each item with care, finding satisfaction in the simple competence of completing necessary work. These mundane activities became opportunities for presence, for experiencing the ordinary bliss that exists in every moment when you're fully awake to it. David taught about the Zen saying before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The teaching points to the understanding that awakening doesn't transport you to some special realm where ordinary responsibilities disappear. You still have to live your actual life. Do your work. Handle daily tasks. The difference is in how you meet these ordinary activities. Before awakening, you're lost in resistance and desire, wanting to be anywhere but here, doing anything but this. After awakening, you can be fully present with chopping wood and carrying water, finding completeness in simple, necessary work, recognizing that enlightenment is right here in the ordinary rather than somewhere else in the extraordinary. Sophie understood this deeply now, teaching at the conservatory, working with students, handling administrative tasks, practicing her own violin, doing household chores. All of it was opportunity for presence, for expressing her Buddha nature through whatever activity arose. She wasn't waiting for some special moment when life would finally be right. Life was right now, exactly as it was, complete and whole in each ordinary moment. The bliss she'd sought through perfect performances and professional achievement was available in washing dishes, walking to campus, sitting in her apartment, listening to rain. Any moment, she stopped reaching elsewhere and simply was here. 6 years into her Zen practice, Sophie received an unexpected phone call from her former teacher at conservatory, the instructor who'd trained her during her undergraduate years. The teacher was retiring and wanted to recommend Sophie for a prestigious professorship at a major music school. It was the kind of position most musicians would consider the pinnacle of academic achievement, a role that would bring significant recognition and influence. Sophie thanked her teacher genuinely, but asked for time to consider the offer. The old Sophie would have accepted immediately, seeing it as validation of her worth. but she needed to check whether this move aligned with her genuine values or was just ego seduction. Sophie sat with the question during meditation, holding it lightly, watching what arose. She noticed excitement about the recognition, noticed the ego preening at being selected for such a position. But beneath that, she felt clarity that her current work at the smaller conservatory was exactly where she wanted to be. She was teaching students she cared about, had creative freedom to integrate contemplative practices with musical training, felt genuinely useful rather than just prestigious. The offer was flattering, but it wasn't actually what she wanted. She declined the position, recommending a colleague who she thought would be excellent and who genuinely desired that kind of role. Her former teacher was surprised, asked if Sophie was sure she understood what she was turning down. Sophie explained that she'd learned through Zen practice to distinguish between genuine aspiration and conditioned desire for status, between what she actually wanted and what she thought she should want based on societal expectations. The prestigious position would bring recognition but not necessarily satisfaction or meaning. Her current work, while less impressive by conventional standards, aligned with her deepest values and brought genuine fulfillment. That alignment was more valuable than any title or recognition. David told Sophie he was proud of her for making that choice, that it demonstrated genuine wisdom about what matters. He said that many people spend their entire lives climbing ladders only to discover they were leaning against the wrong building, pursuing goals they'd been conditioned to want rather than what they genuinely desired. Sophie had learned to check her motivations, to distinguish between authentic aspiration and ego-driven striving. This discernment was one of the fruits of meditation practice. The ability to see clearly what's actually true for you beneath all the conditioning and social pressure. Sophie began writing about her integration of Zen practice and musical training, contributing articles to music education journals about teaching presence alongside technique. Some traditionalists dismissed her approach as touchy-feely nonsense that distracted from serious training, but many educators resonated with her message, recognizing that the conventional model of driving students through relentless criticism and competition often crushed the very creativity and joy it was meant to cultivate. Sophie's articles sparked conversations about alternative approaches to music education, about cultivating presence and authentic expression rather than just technical perfection and competitive achievement. She also started a podcast interviewing musicians who integrated contemplative practices with their artistic work, exploring how meditation, yoga, tai chi, and other practices enhanced creativity and performance. The conversations revealed common themes: the importance of getting out of your own way, trusting intuition beyond conscious control, developing presence that allowed spontaneous response, finding satisfaction in process rather than just outcome. These weren't just musicians' issues, but universal human challenges, which was why the podcast attracted listeners beyond the music world. People in all fields seeking to bring more presence and authenticity to their work. Through all of this external activity, Sophie maintained her daily meditation practice, the foundation that made everything else possible. She sat each morning for 40 minutes, just being present with breath and body, not trying to achieve anything, not seeking special experiences, just sitting. This daily return to simple presence was what kept her grounded, what prevented her teaching and writing from becoming new forms of ego inflation, what reminded her that the point wasn't to become someone impressive, but to be present with what is. The practice was both the foundation and the fruition, both the path and the destination. David grew older, began talking about retiring from teaching at the Zen Center, He asks Sophie to consider taking over leadership of the musicians' meditation group and potentially becoming a full meditation teacher after completing formal training. Sophie felt honored and terrified. Teaching meditation felt like enormous responsibility, something requiring wisdom she didn't feel she possessed. But David reminded her that teachers don't need to be perfect or completely enlightened. They just need to be honest about their practice, authentic about their struggles, clear about what they've learned while acknowledging what they don't know. Sophie agreed to continue her training, to deepen her practice, to prepare to take on this teaching role. As Sophie prepared to step into teaching meditation more formally, she reflected on her journey from that desperate, disconnected violinist sitting in her Wicker Park apartment to who she'd become. The external changes were significant. Different career, different relationship to music, different priorities and values. But the internal transformation was even more profound. She'd learned to be present with her actual experience rather than constantly wishing it were different. She discovered that the bliss she'd been seeking wasn't found in perfect performances or professional achievement, but in simple presence with ordinary reality, in the capacity to be fully here, fully alive, fully herself, without needing to prove anything. The violin that had once been a tool for validation had become an instrument of presence, a way of expressing the aliveness that existed before all achievement and striving. Music wasn't about proving worth anymore, but about celebrating existence, about participating in the creative flow of life, about connecting with others through shared beauty. Sophie could play now with complete freedom because nothing depended on the outcome, because her worth wasn't on the line, because she was simply expressing what she was rather than trying to become something impressive. As these Zen tales settle into your awareness tonight, you might recognize the thread connecting them all, the teaching that's been present in every story we've explored together. Whether Garrett discovering simple presence on a frozen Colorado lake, Isla learning to remain open-hearted while witnessing suffering in Sydney, Mason finding effortless action in his Nashville kitchen, or Sophie reconnecting with music through Beginner's Mind in Chicago. Each person uncovered the same truth beneath their different circumstances. The pure bliss you seek isn't something distant, requiring years of practice to attain. It's the natural state revealed when you stop searching and simply be present with this moment exactly as it is. The Zen masters throughout history have pointed to this radical possibility, that enlightenment isn't a special altered state, but ordinary awareness, recognizing itself. That Buddha nature isn't something you acquire, but what you already are beneath all your ideas about what you should become. Every teaching story we've shared tonight, every koan and practice, points beyond concepts to direct experience of your true nature. The awareness that's been present throughout your entire life, unchanged by all the experiences that have come and gone. Simple and complete, like the sky that holds all weather without being damaged by any storm. As you drift towards sleep, let go of trying to understand or figure out these teachings. Let them work on you without effort, dissolving the barriers between you and the boundless awareness that is your original face. You don't need to become someone better or achieve something more to access this bliss. You simply need to stop long enough to recognize what's already here, what's been here all along, closer than your breath, more intimate than your own thoughts. The simple presence that needs nothing added to be complete. The pure bliss these tales point toward is found in the most ordinary moments when you're fully present with them, drinking tea and actually tasting it, walking and feeling each step, breathing and knowing you're breathing, seeing without thinking about seeing, being without trying to become. This is Zen. Nothing special, nothing complicated, Just this moment, exactly as it is, complete and whole, lacking nothing. The ordinary magic you've been overlooking while searching for something extraordinary. May you rest deeply tonight in the recognition of your own completeness, knowing you are already whole, already awake, already home. May these teachings continue working in your consciousness as you sleep, unlocking the pure bliss that exists within you right now. Not as something created, but as what remains when you stop creating and simply rest in what you are. May you wake refreshed and renewed, carrying forward this quality of presence into whatever tomorrow brings, finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, the sacred in the simple, the infinite in each finite moment. Sleep well, rest deeply, and remember, you are the awareness in which all experience arises, vast and unchanging, pure and complete, nothing lacking, nothing needed. Just this, just now, just being pure bliss itself.